Welcome back. In this video, we'll start with the development of our codeless game. And the first step will be to set up our project. Therefore, let's open up Unity Hub and then create a new project. So this will be a 3D project once again. And I'm going to call this one codeless game. And click create. Then once the project is loaded, let's go over to our sample scene here and create a new 3D object. And here I'm going to create a cube like so. For now, we can leave the cube's name as it is. We can then make sure that it is reset. So the position is 0, 0, 0. So you can scroll in a little bit to see the cube a little better. You can see that this is going to be the cube. As you see, in this case, it really doesn't look like a cube. It looks more like a square. That depends, of course, on the angle at which you're looking at the object. So now that we have our cube, let's take this opportunity to look at the components inside our cube. We already learned about the transform component, which includes the exact position of our game object inside of our active scene, and the collider, which takes care of making our object collide with other objects that also have colliders, as we saw in the last chapter. So basically to interact with our world. But what are the other objects for? What is a mesh filter or a mesh renderer? And why can I change the size of the collider? Well, starting with the collider, remember how the collider was visible in our scene view? So here you can see that this is this green line that you see here on each corner. This indicates where our sphere collider is, and you can change it. So if you go here and, for example, you change the x coordinate to 2, for example, you can see that now the collider will be bigger than the visible object. While the collider will have a width of 2, the cube itself will just have a width of 1. So that is something how you could, for example, trick the player into running into walls that are not really visible. So that's something you have to be very careful with. You shouldn't really do that. Of course, you can change the collider size in all directions. You can even change the center of the collider. So for example, if I move down the collider, you can see that now the collider is underneath the actual object. And that is happening by me changing the y coordinate of the collider, for example. You could have made this collider even smaller. So let's say you wanted the collider to be smaller than the actual object. That is something you can do also. So let's say you go to 0.5 for all directions. Then you would have a collider which is a lot smaller than the visual object. Okay, so we could run inside of this object and we would only hit a wall, so to speak, or we would hit the actual physics of the object once we are inside of the object itself, which is also something that you should try to avoid, except your game is exactly designed so that it should confuse the player by having walls that aren't there where they are supposed to be. Now you could of course also assign different types of colliders. So here we have a box collider, but we could have added different colliders. So here, if you go to physics, you can see that there is a capsule collider, a sphere collider. Let's add the sphere collider. And let's make the sphere collider a little bigger. So let's add a radius of 1, for example. Now you can see that our cube will have a sphere collider. So physically, it will behave like a sphere, even though appearance-wise, it is a cube. So that is something that you should try to avoid, except you really want it to be the case. So now let me actually get rid of the sphere collider, because now I added this extra component, but I don't need it. So you can click on those 3 dots here and then click on remove component in order to get rid of components. So as I said, you should only do that or change the size if you actually want to trick the player, for example, or make it as part of your physics, or if the collider that was added by default is not the correct collider or doesn't really suit the physics of the appearance that you want it to have. So in our game, we'll actually use this in order to show how we could change the difficulty of the game with some tricks that actually are used in the industry. So definitely stay tuned for that. For now, we're going to use the colliders, however. And by the way, you can edit the collider by clicking this icon here as well. And then you can drag the individual sides of the collider also. So you don't have to play around with the size. You can see then the center and size are changed for you if you just drag the surfaces around. So you can drag the different surfaces to different directions and change your collider this way also. So now let's look at this mesh thingy, because if you look at the cube, you see it has a mesh here. It has a cube mesh. Once you click on this icon here, you can select different meshes. So you can, for example, select the capsule mesh. You can see now suddenly the appearance of our item is very different. So it looks more like a capsule, or even the sphere mesh. But of course, the cube mesh is going to be the correct one for the item that we have, because, well, we want to use a cube here. So that's what the mesh filter does for you. It basically just says what's the appearance of the item that we're looking at. So the mesh filter is the component that would cache and prepare it to be pre-rendered in our view by, well, the mesh renderer. That's why you can see all the render options only here, while this one just has the mesh itself. So here you see the mesh renderer options are all here, and you can play around with those, such as lighting. You can change the lighting probes, cast a shadow, you can turn off the shadow can go towards different directions, and so forth. So now let's actually change the cube a little bit, because now we just played around with it, but we didn't change anything. What I would like to have is actually a scale of 15 for the x-axis, because this will be our ground. So let's change the name of this cube, and by the way, you can click on it here until it allows you to change it, or you can change it at the top right here. So once you change it to ground and press tab, you see the inspector will also change accordingly. So this will now be our ground. So now that we have the ground already and we have all the physics and renderers completely correctly, let's actually duplicate this piece, because we're going to position it just on the left hand side, where we will change the angle by 90 degrees so that the block goes up, so to speak. So let's right click and then click duplicate. And now we have the ground twice, even though we can only see it once. But if we move one item, you can see that suddenly there are two items. So they are both there, but they're at the same position. So it looks like they're just one item. So let's change this one, and let's call this one left wall. And now let's change its values up a little bit. So here I'm going to change the rotation of it, which means I'm going to change the Z rotation by 90. So now you see we have a cross, but that's not what I wanted. I want it to be here on the left hand side. So at the position of 7, for example. And then I want to drag it up so that it's just on top of our other item. So here I'm going to use Y as 8. And now duplicate the left wall, or you can copy and paste the left wall by pressing Ctrl C and Ctrl V. And let's rename this. Let's call this one right wall. And let's change the value. And actually, let me see. All right. So now this one will be the right wall. So I moved around to being on the side of my camera. So you see here, this is the direction my camera is going to look at it. So now it makes sense to move the left wall that we had first over to the left hand side. So here the position should be -7 for the left wall. For the X coordinate, the Y coordinate should be 8. The scale is 15 and the Z rotation is 90 degrees. For the right wall, you can see the same values except for the X coordinate, which is at +7. Now finally, let's duplicate the ground and make it the ceiling. So you can press duplicate here, right click duplicate, and now position it at the top. So therefore, you can just position it on top of it right here, which means it will be at 16 for the Y coordinate, because the center point is 15. So here our X scale for the right wall is 15, even though it's turned around. So you have different options, of course, here for your walls, because on one hand, changing a block that has an X scale of 15 and a rotation of 90 is going to create this block that goes all the way up. On the other hand, if you had the Z position or a Z coordinate of 0, so now I'm at the right wall, for example, of 0, the x coordinate is of 1 and the y coordinate of 15, you would receive the same result. Okay, so both of those are going to give you the same result. So either you just duplicate as we have done and rotate, or you can of course use the different scales here. So the coordinates here for your scale, x, y, and z coordinates. So now let's change the ground, by the way. Let's change it to ceiling, like so. So this one, the second ground, will be our ceiling at the top. All right, now inside of the assets folder, let's create a new folder, which I'm going to call materials. Because what you want to make sure is that your assets are cleanly structured, because otherwise it will be difficult to find your items and know where the materials are or where your other game objects are and so forth. So inside of materials, inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to call this one border, because it will hold the color of our borders. In my case, I'm going to use this bluish color here, something like that. I think that's going to be great. And then let's drag this border onto the individual items, so onto the walls, the ceiling, and the ground. And of course, you can select the same color, or you can use any color you want. If you want to use the same color, you need to enter the R, G, and B values that you see here, and you will get the same color. And by the way, make sure to save your scene. So as long as you have the star here, make sure that you will save the scene, otherwise you might lose your progress that you made. So always go here and click on save, and then your scene will be saved. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we are going to keep on building our codeless game. See you there.